It's actually, it's a privilege to give a talk on this day, the feast day of St. Margaret of Scotland, and who herself, as we know, is a migrant and did so much for the country. I will do my talk in 4 stages. One, so the first, just review of the refugee and asylum seekers situation in Scotland. Then I will give a brief discussion of the Scottish government response, which a document was released in 2018, the new Scots Refugee Integration Strategy, which outlines the policy of the government towards refugees, intending it to be implemented within the period of 2018 to 2022. This was for welcoming into Scotland refugees and asylum seekers, that they are able to build their lives from the day they arrive. Then I will talk about the work of our organization, the Refugee Survival Trust, to prevent destitution and support refugees. And then a brief introduction of how you can help us. Refugees in Scotland, they go through desperate journeys, which I'm sure it's been in the media a lot, and you are familiar with. But as far as the UK is concerned, and in fact, truly probably most parts of Europe, the journey is through the Mediterranean routes. And this map is the United Nations High Commission for Refugee recent mapping of the pathways of refugees into Europe. Most of the African refugees come from North Africa, and they go through the UK refugees come through Morocco into Spain, and there find their way into France and other land routes into the UK. These pictures may be quite familiar with us, whereas the media represents asylum in the UK and refugees. Some of the pictures are quite eye-catching. For example, this one wherein you have hundreds of refugees in a boat on the Mediterranean, risking their lives to get to Europe. And during the Bosnian War, masses, again, hundreds of refugees on land trying to find their way into Europe. Children going through every barrier, like barbed wires, just to cross the borders and crowded refugee camps. These type of images do stimulate sympathy in the general public, but the media can also use languages that can be inflammatory and hostile. They can talk of asylum seekers and refugees as illegal immigrants, because most of the people that do come fleeing from danger and war, they are allowed by the 1951 Convention of Refugees to travel without legal papers, so that if they don't have papers when they get into the UK, the Convention of 1951 does regard them to be treated and given refugee status, but then the media can call them illegal immigrants. And also in the media, refugees and asylum seekers can be termed economic migrants, and this sort of stigmatizes refugees. So in situations where the environment is challenging and people are struggling themselves with unemployment, poor accommodation, this can create hostile environment and make the people respond negatively to migrants. Now, this slide is sort of quite a very simplistic thing, which I think with the audience I'm talking to, you are quite familiar with all this. So please excuse me for making it simplistic. But language matters so much in migration. The average British man finds it difficult to make a distinction between asylum seeker and refugee. But all groups have the generic term that of migrants, which is a term used moving from one country to another. But legally and according to the Home Office, the asylum seeker is somebody who has submitted the application and process is impending. The refugee is someone that has had a positive outcome to their application, is granted protection and illegal status. These terminologies are also very important and can mean survival, because an asylum seeker that has had a negative outcome of their application is refused any access to public funding and is at risk of destitution. How are refugees defined and protected by international law? The major document that gives refugees protection is the 1951 Refugee Convention that was held in Geneva, and that defines the refugee. But sadly, even now in 2020, about 48 countries of United Nations members, including the USA, have not accepted the convention. Then we know that the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, again, is the sort of body in the UN that deals with refugee matters and produce policies for their protection. The Migration Policy Institute of Europe, which was formed in response to the war in Syria in 2011, outlined how European countries can contribute to helping and taking a number of refugees from Syria. At a lower level, there's the Global Refugee Forum that meets at various intervals and discusses problems of refugees and gives some points of how to deal with them. Then the Global Compact on Refugees also is a body that meets and discusses the impact of various situations on refugees. Now, refugees in Scotland, I would want to group them into the two large cities, Edinburgh and Glasgow. And these two groups of refugees are very different in status as far as the Home Office is concerned, and are also different in their well-being and access to public funds. In Edinburgh, most of the refugees that there are come under this Migration Policy Institute of Europe that was held in Paris in 2011. And these are mainly the Syrian refugees that have got what they call sort of European relocation policy. And they come, they are provided with accommodation, everything for their well-being is prepared And so they settle quite easily. Most of these refugees are in Edinburgh. At the other extreme, we have in Glasgow, for a long time now, for decades, we have refugees that come on their own and have to make applications to the Home Office, and it goes through periods of time. They don't have access to public funding, are at risk with homelessness and destitution. And so we have, and these are the groups that we in the Refugee Survival Trust deal with on day-to-day basis. Now this picture, so the environment of refugees is sort of, this as the artist, Frances Bruno, she looks at it and gives what the refugees feel when they are traveling. Internally, we all know these are traumatized people. So as they leave and they travel, whatever danger they are running from, they are full of fear, of anxiety and distress. Then they come into an environment in whatever country they find themselves. They are faced with intimidating laws, insecurity, barriers in communication, language, culture, no access to funding. They have lack of access to public services, have no employment, education, healthcare is not accessible to them, housing is a problem, and this results in a homelessness and destitution. After many years of conversations and negotiations with the Scottish government, in 2018, the Scottish government came up with this document, New Scots Refugee Integration Strategy. And the outcomes of that strategy says refugees and asylum seekers should live in safe, welcoming and cohesive communities and able to build diverse relationships and connections in Scotland. It also as that refugees and asylum seekers should understand their rights, responsibilities, and entitlements, and are able to exercise them to pursue full and independent lives. Thirdly, that refugees and asylum seekers are able to access well-coordinated services which recognize and meet their rights and needs. Well, just going by, yeah. Fourthly, that the policy, sort of whatever policy the government goes through should have strategic planning and legislation which have an impact on refugees and asylum seekers, that these policies and planning should be based on their rights, needs, and aspirations. A very beautiful document and giving a lot of hope to organizations working for refugees and refugees themselves. And the theme of the New Scots integration strategy is, I've seen here in circles, it goes, recognizes the needs of asylum seekers, employability, welfare rights, housing, education, language, health and well-being, communities, culture, and social connections. Very beautiful, giving a holistic policy in dealing with refugees. But then we ask, how successful is the New Scots refugee integration strategy? The failing of the policy is that the Home Office has its own policy, which does not reflect what the Scottish policy is, because the Home Office Refugees make applications to the Home Office, and it goes through a period of processing until the Home Office gives them entitlement to access of public funds, even medical health and all that. Then it does not give them the rights, it does not give them access to health care, home, housing, education, not to speak of employment. So in essence, the two policies are at variance, and that's where the real difficulty is. And because of that difference in policy, refugees and asylum seekers are at high risk of destitution. And we in the Refugee Survival Trust, we come in to fill that gap. However, the Home Office have made some concessions due to COVID, because now people arriving in Glasgow can apply for asylum in Glasgow instead of having to travel down to Croydon and to submit the application. So that's one good effect of COVID. Now, the Refugee Survival Trust, which is the organization I work with to prevent destitution, was formed in 1996. It was a result of the Bosnian War, when there were refugees in Glasgow and they were homeless, and then a few individuals in Glasgow came up and decided to form an organization that would help destitute refugees. The vision of RST is that all refugees and asylum seekers in Scotland receive just and respectful treatment and support appropriate to their needs. And our mission is to do everything within our available resources and powers to achieve that vision by enabling and supporting asylum seekers and refugees in need, particularly those at risk of destitution. Now, work of the Refugee Survival Trust. We recognize that refugees are human beings, and so we work to meet their needs. And we focus on to contribute to prevention and alleviation of destitution among asylum seekers and refugees by meeting their basic needs. We increase opportunities for refugees and asylum seekers to be active citizens. We raise awareness of the issues facing asylum seekers and refugees, particularly those faced with destitution. And from the information we get in our work, we can help other agencies or governments and contribute to the development of policy and good practice with reference to refugees and asylum seekers that are at risk of destitution. How RST achieves its aims by giving destitution grants. Now, destitution grants, and as I said, people who have fallen within the gap stage, wherein their papers are being processed and they do not have access to public funds. We give them destitution grants to cover their basic needs. The amount we give is in 2 weekly phases, and we help them apply to other sources, other charities in Scotland to fill in the gap while they are waiting for their status to be processed by the Home Office. When asylum seekers have achieved positive outcome and they get refugee status, they do apply to educational institutions, universities, colleges to improve their process of employability. And we give them grants to help buy equipment and other accessories for their studies, and this we call access to education and employment grants. And sometimes the refugees have their educational certificates in a foreign language. And for them to be able to have access to further education to improve their chances of education, that needs to be translated into English. And our access to education and employment grants pays towards that. RST works in partnership with other agencies, for example, the Scottish Refugee Council, to develop projects to support people seeking asylum. We give travel grants for Home Office appointments in Croydon or Liverpool. We give bus passes to college. We have the Baby and Bump Scheme, which is a scheme that gives grants and bus passes for pregnant women and young mothers. Then we have a befriending scheme, which the locals we couple locals in Glasgow with refugees, and they form a friendship link for a minimum of 6 months. The Scottish people will take the refugee around and show them places of interest in Glasgow, and they develop some bonding, and that had been quite successful because some of those befriending volunteers have formed long-term relationships with the refugees, and it makes them settle into the community. Then we have the Destitute Asylum Seeker Service, DAS, which one of the main function of DAS is like a legal clinic, because we have lawyers involved with that, and the DAS projects, we do it in partnership with other charities like the Scottish Refugee Council, Strathclyde University, Glasgow Night Shelter. And the people who attend the DAS system, they discuss their application process. They discuss the language in the application and the legal language in the asylum system, because the language can be very intimidating to the lay person. As we go through dealing with the refugees, we do have an insight into the problems, and so it's more like is a research into the causes of destitution. And this RST uses this information and experience to influence national policy that make changes to the root causes of destitution. Campaigning is one we do as well, because the work gives us awareness about problems and refugees and asylum seekers in the wider community. And so that puts us in position to campaign for the well-being of refugees and asylum seekers. This slide summarizes our work, RST work, because we recognize the well-being of refugees And this pyramid is what Maslow's hierarchy of happiness. So basically it says that for people to be happy, it goes from the basic, their physiological needs, then it goes into a pyramid. The tip of the pyramid is self-actualization, and which gives them a meaning, development of their inner potential. So the work we do, the work of refugee, we start like the destitution grants goes the base of the pyramid, the education, befriending scheme, all that fits in quite well with the research of Maslow's research into happiness. And then of course, our vision is incorporated into that hierarchy as well. Our vision is Scotland to be a welcoming, inclusive, safe Scotland for all refugees and asylum seekers, where they can live free of poverty to fulfill their potential as individuals and in the community. A graph shows how our destitution grants have increased over the years. And this other graph below shows that the adults and children that we had given destitution grants, because often it is said that only adults that are at risk of destitution, but in fact, over the years, we have had unaccompanied children, and they are also supported by us. Then various nationalities, this really just for interest purpose, it shows we have like Iran, and Pakistan, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Eritrea, various countries all over Africa that come and make use of our destitution grant system. Now, RST during COVID. During the COVID crisis, of course, our key service was caring for the people that lived in our RST temporary accommodations. Make sure that they kept to themselves and others safe by reinforcing the messages with strong pictorial representation and translated materials, because some of our refugees are not fluent in English, and if I'm, all of them, I would say English is not their first language, so we use pictorial representations. Then in collaboration with the British Red Cross, we had emergency living grants. Our key objective was to keep all our clients, staff, and volunteers safe by ensuring that everyone had access to the public health and health messages given by the government in an appropriate and usable form. We stopped having Zoom, we stopped having face-to-face board meetings, and we had Zoom board meetings and interviews, which was quite successful. And by also supporting people who can no longer join in our usual activities. We suspended that because we had activities like the Will Welcome, which is mainly for toddlers and their parents, and internships, which is we do have refugees now and again happy in our offices. So we stopped these services and we set up telephone and online support groups. We ensure that people are connected both locally and with their families around the world by providing mobile phones We work in partnership with many other organizations in Glasgow, for example, the British Red Cross, Scottish Refugee Council, Sahelia, the Law Clinic of University Strathclyde, Glasgow Clyde College. So all these are partnership. We work for the same purpose, to help refugees. Now, how can you help us? Become an RST member. We are a small charity, but we make a big difference in the lives of vulnerable people. And so we depend upon the generosity and help and support of people like you, which you have given before. Last year, I think you made us a donation, and we were very grateful for that. Making donations, fundraising for RST is volunteers that fundraise for us, sponsoring all events, and then volunteer us with RST or other organizations, because we need various things, various people to help. For example, a website volunteer to help us develop and improve our website. So in essence, everyone has a role, a contributing role to be inclusive and implementation of the new SCOTS strategy, by showing support for refugees and asylum seekers. For example, welcoming refugees, asylum seekers and migrants in your local community, finding out more about refugees and asylum seekers, and just a few organizations in Glasgow that are working with refugees, and the RST, our website, you can donate through our website, the Scottish Refugee Council, the Welcoming, which is actually based in Edinburgh, the Refugee Action, Freedom from Torture. There are many of these Scottish organizations that are on the website. This is thank you for supporting us, and this image actually comes from our refugees, wherein we had an event, and they wrote in various languages, and to thank the community for caring for them.